Hi, I'm Pastor Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you our weekly devotion, first one for this month of March. I'm going to read to you from a passage that I was reading in my Bible reading this morning that just impacted me in a whole new kind of way here today. Joshua chapter 10 and verse 12 says, "Then Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the children of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, till the people had revenge upon their enemies. Is this not written in the book of Jasher? So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven, and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. And there has been no day like that, before it or after it, that the Lord heeded the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel." So this is obviously an extraordinary account for a lot of reasons, but it kind of struck me as I began to think about it today. Joshua is many things. He's a leader, he's a general, he's been a spy, he's a warrior, he's been an assistant to Moses, a lot of different hats that he's worn along the way. But one thing he definitely was not was a scientist. And so as he stands there on the battlefield and he looks at the need of himself and the army of Israel on that day, he's not realizing that the earth is rotating at roughly 1,000 miles per hour. He didn't know that that same earth was hurling around the sun at about 67,000 miles an hour. He couldn't have known that our whole solar system, including that sun, is whirling around our galaxy at about 490,000 miles per hour. And he couldn't have realized that our galaxy and the others around it are moving in space at a speed of nearly 2.2 million miles per hour. The universe is in a constant state of high-speed motion. Everything is constantly moving. He didn't realize any of this. He didn't realize that all of that movement is a necessary component of how God designed and ordained the universe, and that there are literally trillions of interconnected dependencies, how that the movement of one body in space affects another, and how that rotation affects things like the seasons and gravity and the weather and the trillions of organisms on our planet that depend on things being just so. All of this is a very finely tuned process that only an infinite God could create, to where everything stays in a constant state of motion. But even in the midst of that, that there is a calm that allows life to thrive and life to be produced. He didn't know any of these things. He just knew that he and God's people needed more hours in the day to finish the battle. So, without hesitation, he speaks to God, and then in God's authority commands the sun and the moon to stop in their tracks. The universe in this constant state of high-speed motion, and one man standing on a battlefield says, "Stop." And they did. However, God accomplished it, and there are different means that he could have accomplished this, but it doesn't matter how he did it. This request required changing the course of the very universe itself. What Joshua is asking for is beyond impossible. It is so incomprehensible. The different factors and forces that would have to be in place, the impossibilities of physics and all the laws that govern our universe, all of these things would have to be violated in a way that should be catastrophic and cataclysmic, because everything is so finely tuned to operate in a very certain way according to very certain parameters. And so Joshua is asking for something that inconveniences the entire universe, and so that he can have a little bit of convenience on the battlefield. It is beyond ridiculous. It is beyond impossible what he asks. And yet God does it. And that raised two questions for me that I want to pose to you here today. And that first of those is this. If Joshua had understood just how big a thing he was asking, would he still have asked it? if he knew all of these things that I have described here today and all that modern science knows about the way that the universe functions and the speed of these planetary bodies and how interconnected everything is and how all of these different forces affect the other and they're all finely tuned to create the possibility of life existing, would Joshua have asked something that could, in a sense, imperil the whole universe? Would he have asked such a big thing if he knew how big it was? I think that one of our great challenges is that often we know the complexities and the difficulties of a situation maybe too well, or at least we fixate on that a little bit too much. And very likely we are going to reason ourselves right out of even asking God for something, or just conclude in advance that it is too big or too difficult, too complex. I wouldn't even ask such a thing of God. Joshua maybe didn't understand all these things, but he obviously did understand his God. He had seen his God do the impossible many times before. And so if this was one more impossibility, what was that to God? And that leads me to question number 2. And that's this: did the difficulty of the task make any difference to God? Well, clearly it did not. God treated this as if it were just as simple as the way that Joshua posed the request. That, Joshua sees the slow movement of the sun across the sky, and, Joshua's asking for it to just pause where it is and to stay there and to give him more time in the day. And that seems like, on the surface, a relatively simple thing if you don't understand at all what's actually going on from what you can see. But to God, what difference did it make? What is a literal impossibility to any other being or any other force in the universe, it was effortless to him. He could answer that request with all of its complexity as simply as he could have asked if it really were as simple as what Joshua was asking. You see, there's some really important things that come out of this, and that is this. From Joshua's perspective, Joshua doesn't seem to have worried too much about the logistics. He saw that there was a need. He asked God to meet it. Simple. He let God worry about the logistics. He let God be God. If the situation was impossible, then it wasn't impossible to his God, and so he allowed his God to deal with all of that. And so very simply, Joshua had faith in the truest kind of way. He had faith that no matter how big or how difficult or even how impossible the situation was, that his God was big enough to do it. And so he simply asked God to do it. He let God be God. And today, I want us to consider that for a moment. That rather than worrying about how it's going to be accomplished, which I will freely confess I'm terrible about, even when I'm asking God to do it, my mind is trying to figure out the steps whereby God can accomplish what I have asked him to do. But frankly, God doesn't need my help figuring that out. That's a me problem. That's my mind being overactive and trying to grasp onto control in some way. But it doesn't change at all what God is going to do, because very often God doesn't even do it in the way that I thought he would do it, or do it in the way that I thought made the situation doable or fixable or repairable. God does things in his own way, in his own timing, and in hindsight, it's always better than the way I had it figured out anyway. So Joshua just let God worry about the details. And shouldn't we do the same? Paul put it in a really, really clear and succinct way. He said in Philippians 4:6, he says, "Be anxious for nothing, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your request be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus." Paul says, don't be stressed about it. Don't be anxious about it, but just go to God in prayer and a thankful heart and just let your requests be made known to him. Ask him. Jesus says you have not because you ask not. So Paul says just ask him, and then have the peace of knowing that even if you have no idea how this is achievable or possible, God does. And even if it is impossible, it's not impossible to him. He can do it. He can solve it. He can fix it. And so we can have peace, knowing that God's in control, even in the most impossible of situations. Even if you're standing in the most ludicrous situation and looking at the sun in the sky and saying, "Sun, stand still." And God says, "You know what? There is a need here today, and this is a big deal, but no problem, Joshua. Sun, stand still. Moon, stand still. Joshua, you got all the time you need. Finish what needs to be done. That's the kind of God that we serve. And it's not just Joshua that served a God like that. That's the kind of God that you and I serve. We can have faith in Him because He is a God of the impossible. So don't be afraid today to ask, sun, stand still.